Okay, this is Unit 3, Lecture 2. Sorry, Unit 3, Lecture 3. An Age of Reform, about all of those. Sorry, I've got something popping up here, and I'm not sure why it keeps doing it. About all of those different reforming movements during the middle of the 1800s. About 100 reform communities were founded in the couple of decades before the Civil War, and historians usually call them utopian societies. Back in the 1500s, there was a novel written by Thomas More, who is today recognized as St. Thomas More, called Utopia, and it was about founding an ideal society in the New World. He wrote this in like the 1520s, so the New World was really, really new to Europeans, and they didn't know yet the people who lived here. They didn't really know much about it, but they kind of thought, man, we can go over there and we can set up this absolutely ideal kind of life. So they borrowed that name and gave it to these communities that were being founded in the early to mid-1800s, trying to create some kind of perfect world. Most of these utopian communities were founded on some kind of religious belief, but there were some that were entirely secular. And nearly all of these communities had as their goal some cooperative form of society, with social harmony, with at least some form of equality, and especially the religious communities were usually looking for some way to completely eliminate sin. Now, through the efforts of all of these different utopian communities, reforming communities, we get the words socialism and communism entering the political language. Communism not as the state socialist systems of the Soviet Union or the People's Republic of China, but more in terms of as a commune. In this case, to have a social organization where everything is shared, where productive property is owned by the community. Most utopian societies, whether they were religious or secular, usually also tried to find some way to fix gender roles, to reform that. Some of them tried to do that by not allowing any sexual relations between men and women. Others had kind of a semi-free love hippie kind of thing going on. Nearly all of them, though, insisted that creating a good cooperative community meant ending private property and meant also ending men's property in women. Our religious communities attracted folks who were looking for the elimination of sin, a retreat from sin. The Shakers, who were probably the most successful of the religious communities, they had a significant impact on the outside world as well. At their peak during the 1840s or so, there were Shaker towns across America from Maine down to Kentucky. They had more than 5,000 members. Now, religiously, the Shakers believed that God had a dual personality, kind of two sides of a coin. There's female and male. So to them, the sexes were equal. Now, one of the pillars of Shaker faith that they used to uphold that equality was a real challenge to traditional 19th century gender roles. Because Shakers did not allow marriage at all. They thought that that was a foundation of inequality for men and women. In fact, they didn't allow sex at all. Men and women lived in separate dorms. They did eat in communal dining rooms together. They did worship together, but a single man and woman not supposed to be alone together. Now, obviously, they could not keep their numbers growing by raising their children in the faith. So they got a lot of converts, and they also adopted orphan children. The Shakers also rejected the idea of private property. Everything in this community is owned by everyone in this community. They were, however, very economically successful. But for people who don't believe in private property, it was kind of a shock to the outside world at the time how successful economically they were. The Shakers were among the first people to sell seeds through catalogs, which a lot of people use today. They sold herbal medicine. They were also famous for their furniture, right, which still, Shaker-style furniture is still very famous. Another influential and very controversial community was Oneida. It was founded in upstate New York by John Humphrey Noyes. That actually tried to start it in Vermont in the 1830s. They became notorious for their we'll call it rejection of mainstream sexual morality. That's a polite way to say it. They were run out of town, and they settled up at Oneida, New York in 1848. And because they were a religious community, they did have a lot more success than other communities. Oneida survived in New York until 1881, so for more than 30 years they lasted. Oneida, like many reform groups, not just utopian communities, but like a lot of reform groups, believed in the idea of perfectionism, that people could become sinless in this life, that they could choose to eliminate sin. And to do that, Noyes and the elders of Oneida wanted to take away any opportunity for sin. They believed, they kind of looked around, what is the root of all sin? They kind of decided that greed and jealousy were what prompted most sins to be committed. So they wanted to eliminate any reason, any opportunity to commit those sins. So the community owned everything together. There's no private property in Oneida, so there's no need for greed. Whatever your neighbor has, you also have. And there is no monogamous marriage in Oneida, so there's no need for sexual jealousy. They called it complex marriage, what they did. Any man and any woman could have relations as long as they wanted, could part friends, could go have other relations, as long as it was recorded by the elders of the community. So they had to keep track of who was getting with who. Because, 3 generations down the road, we don't want brothers and sisters accidentally getting together, so we need to know who's been where. Now, in the beginning, that was meant to eliminate sin. It was meant to eliminate the need for jealousy. By the time the community is on its last legs, by the time it's starting to fall apart, though, that complex marriage idea is actually being used to sort of primitively genetically engineer children by having certain community members being told to produce children together. And some elders also use this to get all the pretty young girls for themselves. Now, to outsiders, utopian communities like Oneida especially seem to be bizarre and also almost like voluntary slavery. But because their members had such a selfless devotion to the teachings and the rules of their leaders, spiritual communities often lasted quite a long time. The Shakers were still really a force into the early 1900s. And Sabbath Day Lake Shaker Village in Maine, the last I looked, had 3 surviving members. In 2013, there were still 3 surviving members there. Communities that lacked a religious basis tended to have a lot more internal division, usually didn't last quite as long, but were often very entertaining. One of those was the community at Brook Farm. Brook Farm was founded by those darn transcendentalists, the ones who believed in individualism and throwing off all the shackles of society and doing your own thing and developing yourself. Thoreau, Emerson, they're transcendentalists. Well, at Brook Farm, they tried to form a society where they thought everybody would be able to do that. They said that in traditional society, in mainstream society, a man who is a farmer gets up with the sun, he works his butt off all day long, he goes to bed when the sun is down, and at least as far as they can tell, that farmer doesn't have the opportunity to learn science or learn philosophy or learn politics or learn Greek or whatever it is that he might actually be talented in he might really be able to use if he had the opportunity to learn it. But he doesn't have that opportunity because he's working so hard on just basic day-to-day life things. So at Brook Farm, they thought they could bring all of these different people together from different backgrounds, you know, people who have hard-working farm backgrounds and factory backgrounds and blacksmiths, and also philosophers and musicians and artists and poets. And they would all divide the work. And everybody would be responsible for some cooking and some cleaning and some farming and some whatever is necessary. And because the work would be shared, then everybody would have more time to themselves. And everybody would have, you know, a certain number of hours in the day where they could go off and learn something that they think could help them develop themselves. The problem that they ran into was most of the people that they actually got to come to Brook Farm were the artists and the writers and the poets, not the people who actually had any background in doing manual labor. So it wasn't long before they were complaining about all of this work that they had to do. Sort of like, you know, City Slickers, the movie. You go out to the Dude Ranch for a week, and it's a lot of fun. For a week. 2 weeks, it starts to get a little boring. You look ahead, and the rest of your life is spent that way, and you've never had to work that hard before. You know, then it doesn't look quite so appealing. People started to complain, you know, why do I have to go slop the pigs? I would be of more use to the community if you would let me write my poetry. That's what I'm good at. And so the whole thing kind of fell apart. Probably the most important secular thinker, utopian thinker, not just for the United States, but actually for the whole transatlantic region, was probably Robert Owen. He was a British factory owner. He was Welsh by birth, and he married a girl whose father owned factories up in Scotland. And he became appalled at the living conditions of the workers in the early Industrial Revolution. He first bought these factories from his father-in-law in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And children were working. They were bringing in children from like orphan asylums to work in these factories. Like I think they had like 500 or 600 kids working in these factories. And parents, you know, weren't being paid enough, and they were working like 14-hour days, and their kids would come in and work too. There was no education going on. There was hardly any sanitation in the factory towns. The housing that these people had access to was absolutely terrible. And so Robert Owen decided he was going to do something about that. He created what became the first model factory town for his workers in New Lanark, Scotland. It had safe, clean, comfortable housing for families. It had public education, free public education for the children, and the children could actually attend school because the parents were paid well enough that they didn't have to take their kids out of school and send them to work instead. There was sanitation. He even advocated, first he cut the workday down to 10 hours, and then he advocated for laws requiring an 8-hour workday. He said that, you know, and remember, he's a factory owner. He's not a factory worker. He said that his workers should work for 8 hours, sleep for 8 hours, and then have 8 hours to develop themselves. Right? This is this individualistic ideal that a lot of people had. They should be able to have recreation, to learn things, to spend time with their families. He came to the United States around 1824. He bought out the Harmony community in Indiana, and he hoped to create this perfect new moral world. In his plan for New Harmony in the United States, he was going to go even further than he did in Scotland. Children would be taken out of their family home, and they would be sent to live in schools where they would learn to cooperate. They would learn to work toward the common good. They would learn to work toward this early utopian form of communism. Owen also wanted his community to create an equal world. where all of the private property, again, is shared by everybody in the community. He was concerned with women's equality. He wanted women to have access to education, access to the workforce, what work they wanted to do. He thought they should have the right to divorce. At New Harmony, he promised that women would no longer be enslaved, as he said, to their husbands, and they could crush all of those old mainstream notions about the differences between men and women. But New Harmony had no harmony. They just had a lot of problems. They squabbled about everything from the community's constitution to who could use what property. Yeah, it's supposed to be for everybody, but I brought this into the community, so shouldn't I have first crack at it? His model factory town in Scotland, New Lanark, it became, a long-lasting model village. You can still visit it today. But New Harmony, Indiana, only lasted for a couple of years. When it broke up, though, the people who left New Harmony are going to take with them ideas that strongly influence the labor movement, education reform, women's rights, abolition. They're going to go into all of those reform movements. So even though this community just lasted for, just a speck of time, it's going to have a long-lasting impact outside of its actual community. Now, there were a couple of big anarchist communities founded by Josiah Warren, who was probably the first really famous American anarchist. Because these were anarchist communities, though, they didn't have a hierarchy. They didn't want any person to have any more power, any more wealth than anybody else. They wanted it completely even. Not just equality of opportunity, but equality of outcome as well. Now, they did want to keep the place afloat financially, so they made goods that could be sold to keep these anarchist communities running. But they said that they weren't going to charge based on who made it. They were going to charge based on how many hours of work went into it. Everybody's labor is equal, but something that takes 5 minutes to make will be cheaper than something that takes you 5 hours to make. They also believed strongly in individualism and getting rid of all the social constraints. But because there was no hierarchy and because there was no leader, when there was a disagreement in these communities, they just kind of fell apart. What all of these communities had in common, though, not just the anarchist communities, but Brook Farm and New Harmony, and even just the Shakers and Oneida and a lot of other religious communities, they all tended to believe that a community of equals would be the best kind of community. And if they could just hit on the right way to run it, it could survive. Now, most Americans kind of looked askance at what all these groups were doing. I mean, get rid of private property. You can't do that. Private property is the key to independence for most Americans in this era. And marriage is the foundation of the social order. You can't get rid of that. That's crazy talk. So very few Americans were drawn to actually join these utopian communities. They were, however, heavily influenced by the ideas inside them. Most reform movements, which were extremely popular in the North especially, most of them were aimed at freeing people from outside influences that held them back, like drinking or illiteracy or slavery. Many of these mainstream reform movements were heavily based on the ideas of the Second Great Awakening, and they were very popular in the same areas where the Second Great Awakening had been very popular. The Great Awakening said that God had created man to be, basically, make morally free choices. You can decide how you want to live. Reformers took that idea and started to say, not only can sinners reform themselves, they can also remake the world. Now, the Second Great Awakening revivals popularized that idea of perfectionism, which the religious utopian communities had been so heavily based on. They believed that people were capable of infinite improvement, right? That you can make yourself utterly free of sin right now. You don't have to wait until you die and go to heaven and all the sins be washed away. You can fix yourself right now. and you can fix society too. Under these revivals, reform movements that had been much more moderate in the past moved into new and very radical directions. Temperance, there actually was a temperance movement back in the 1700s, and it meant moderation in alcohol. But in the 1830s and 1840s and 50s, it came to mean outlawing drinking entirely. Not moderation, just no more drinking. Criticism of war was quite common, again, in the late 1700s as we're moving out of the Revolution. Criticism of the way that wars were fought, targeting of civilian populations, blah, blah, blah. 1830s, outright pacifism. Now just change the way wars are fought, no more wars. And critics of slavery began to demand not that, pussyfooting gradual abolition that the North did, but immediate total abolition. To members of the northern middle class, reform, being a part of one of these groups was like a badge of respectability. Belonging to a reform group was a sign that you were in control of your life, you were a morally upright, accountable person, and in fact you were so accountable that you could go out and tell other people how they should live their lives. Groups like the American Temperance Society became very popular in this atmosphere. That particular society, that particular branch of the temperance movement, was founded in 1826, and it intended to redeem not just the hopeless alcoholic, but also any casual drinkers. Now, there was a legitimate problem with alcoholism and alcohol abuse throughout the 1800s into the early 1900s in the United States. People drank a lot. Men would take their wage packet at the end of the week, they would go to the tavern, and then the money would be gone, and they wouldn't have money for rent or food, and sometimes they would get drunk and come home and beat on their wives and kids. So there is a legitimate issue here. And by the 1830s, the American Temperance Society claimed to have persuaded hundreds of thousands of Americans to renounce the demon rum, no more drinking. And it is true that by 1840, alcohol consumption was down quite a bit. The assumption that a lot of students have is that the world is constantly getting worse. Like our teenage pregnancy rate must be worse now than it was 50 years ago, and our drinking must be worse now than it was 100 years ago. It's actually not. Neither of those are true. Today, the average American drinks about 2 gallons of alcohol per year. 1840 drank about 3.5 gallons per year. And actually in 1830, when the Temperance Society really started revving up, people were drinking about 7 gallons a year. And many Americans, though, looked at these reform movements and thought, that's great for you, but I don't want to do that, and I don't think I should have to. They saw these reforms as an attack on their personal freedom. Lots of men went to taverns. It was a popular meeting place. It's where you went after work. It was a place to hear political debates, for meetings, for recreation. Drinking was a part of most public events. And people questioned why they should have to stop doing something that they don't have a problem with. American Catholics especially felt attacked. This is the era where we started to get mass numbers of especially Irish and German immigration. And they were often hostile to a lot of these reform movements. First, these reform movements were often hostile to them. Catholics understood sin differently than evangelical Protestants did in the early 1800s. They did not believe in the idea of perfectionism. They believed that sin was original, it was an inescapable burden. You cannot perfect yourself. Only God can do that once you die. So when all of these Protestants are going around saying, oh, you can make yourself free of sin right now, and we can make society free of sin, and we can make it all perfect, Catholics saw it as an attack not just on their lifestyles, but on their religion. And they bitterly opposed when the reformers were fighting to impose Protestant values on them. The reformers had to reconcile their desire to create moral order with their desire to also increase personal freedom. To do this, they had to use a vision of freedom that was liberating and controlling both at the same time. On the one hand, reformers said that their goal is to create genuine liberty. On the other, they said that genuine liberty comes from self-discipline. And if you don't want to discipline yourself, we can do that for you. In some ways, these reformers were kind of Puritan. They believed that Americans had too much natural liberty, like John Winthrop had said to the Puritans. Instead, we should have moral liberty, only the freedom to do what's right. And a lot of these reformers were worried about westward expansion, folks moving out into the frontier, worried that these people going out there didn't have enough self-control, enough self-discipline. They're going to go out there, they're going to create towns filled with, taverns and dance halls and on Sundays. So they created groups like the American Bible Society and the American Tract Society to flood the West with all sorts of pamphlets and copies of the Bible and sermons explaining, reminding them, this is the way you're supposed to live. Don't think because you're out there beyond the bounds of polite society that you can just do whatever you want to. Now, the tension between liberation and control in these movements became really obvious in the institutions that these reformers created. And these institutions that they were building were meant to remake humans into free, morally upright, productive citizens. Back in the colonial era, there hadn't been a lot of institutions, a lot of social solutions to problems. Most crime had been punished by whipping, fines, banishment, beheading, or hanging. Poor people went to their families for help or they didn't get any help. Orphans lived with neighbors or on the streets. The mentally ill were locked in attics. There was no other solution for it. During the 1830s and 1840s, though, different groups embarked on this program of institution building, finding solutions for society's problems, shared solutions, and they called this idea social goods. We are bettering society. We're doing what's good for society. And all those institutions were, again, built on the idea of perfectionism, that social ills could be completely cured. Prisons and mental asylums would eventually become overcrowded places where people were just kind of locked up and held at bay away from society. But in the beginning, they were actually meant to fix, to reform the people inside, to make them into productive, disciplined citizens. And Dorothea Dix was probably the most famous person involved with trying to find more humane treatment for the mentally ill and also to try and find cures for mental illness. And so the creation of mental asylums, or as they used to call them, insane asylums. She was a part of that movement. Now, we have to understand that the mental health in the 1830s and 1840s, the practices of mental health professionals is not what we in 2000 whatever would consider great. If people were excitable, if they were bipolar, if they experienced a manic episode, wrap them in wet sheets to calm them down. That was standard. Lock them in a rubber room. Lobotomies were becoming, unfortunately, very common, removing part of the frontal lobe. But that was meant to fix people. It was meant to reform society. It 100% didn't work, but that's what they were trying to do. Prisons. Prisons were meant to be places where people could be kept away from society, but while they are there, they will learn skills. They will learn better ways to be citizens. They will become productive. They won't have to live a life of crime anymore. Now again, within just a few years, the prisons will be places where people learn to be better criminals instead of more productive free members of society. But in the beginning, They were meant to perfect people. Now, the biggest mass effort at institution building before the Civil War came in the common school movement, what we would now call the public school movement, tax-supported state school systems open to all children. In the early 1800s, most kids had no formal education. Horace Mann was a member of the Massachusetts State Board of Ed, and he became the leading school reformer. And he had a couple of goals. He wanted to increase equality, and he thought that he could do that by giving children an equal education, an equal playing field. And he also wanted American children to grow up to be productive members of a marketplace society. You know, when we're moving into this world that is being based less and less on family farms and more on corporate farms, more on factory work, more on finance and education and service, and you've got this global marketplace that you have to serve, you can't have your population be illiterate. You can't have them not understanding basic accounting. You know, if we want the country to thrive, I mean the nation to thrive, then we need an educated populace. And that starts with, you know, sending the 5-year-olds off to school. He wanted children to have a common learning experience, to be equipped to advance, to be ready to help raise the United States up. And he also wanted them to be good workers. So part of the common school movement was learning to follow orders, learning to sit still, learning to do what you're told, learning to recognize authority, which is you know, one of the complaints that people have about public schools today. And when parents send their kids to charter schools or to, you know, Montessori schools, a lot of what they're looking for is a school that won't just teach rote memorization and obedience, and they're worried that public schools do that too much, because in the beginning that is one of the things that they were supposed to do. The labor groups, factory owners, middle-class reformers, they all supported the idea of the common schools. By 1860, every northern state had created some kind of tax-supported school system for their children. Now, that common school movement did also create the first real career opportunities for women. They began to dominate the teaching profession. The South, though, did not join in. The planters saw literate poor whites and free blacks as a threat to their power, and they had no intention of taxing themselves to pay for the children of poor men to go to schools. It's not going to be until Reconstruction after the Civil War that the South is going to get their first public education system. So that's one of the many ways in which the North and the South are growing apart. Now, compared with drinking and Sabbath breaking and illiteracy, the greatest evil in American society at first did not attract that much attention. For many years, it seemed like the only Americans willing to challenge slavery were slaves and free African Americans, and sometimes your Quakers and Methodists. Before the 1830s, when prominent American politicians, I should say, talked about ending slavery, they almost always supported the idea of colonization. Colonization meant taking former slaves and sending them somewhere else, sending them to Africa, to the Caribbean, to Central America, somewhere other than here. A very few white Americans believed or supported the idea of an integrated society. And they founded the American Colonization Society in 1816. It promoted gradual abolition, possibly even paying slave owners for the loss of their property, and sending the former slaves somewhere else. They established the country of Liberia on the coast of West Africa as part of this colonization movement. Liberia, still today actually, is kind of an outpost of American influence in West Africa. The power structure in Liberia has always been descended from former American slaves. The capital of Liberia is Monrovia. It was named for President Monroe. As the 1800s move on, though, colonization is going to be less and less popular. It was quite appealing to white Americans who did not think that former slaves could have a real place in the United States. Henry Clay and even Andrew Jackson supported colonization. Many supporters believed that slavery was so deeply embedded in American life that African Americans could never be equal, could never really be free if they stayed here. Colonization was kind of like Indian removal, actually. It rested on the assumption that America was fundamentally only for whites. Most African Americans, though, vehemently opposed the idea of colonization. In fact, the formation of that colonization society galvanized free black communities to claim their rights as Americans. In 1817, the very year after the Colonization Society was founded, 3,000 free black men gathered in Philadelphia for the first National Black Convention. And they insisted that they were Americans. And they were entitled to the same freedoms and the same rights enjoyed by white Americans. And the abolitionist movement shifted as well in the late 1820s, early 1830s. It differed profoundly from what had come before. This new generation of reformers drew on the idea that slavery was a sin and the idea that it violated America's meaning. And when something is a sin, you don't say, oh, but we'll gradually stop this and we'll pay you to stop sinning and we will take the victims of your sin somewhere else so you don't have to see them anymore, you don't have to see the consequences of what you did anymore. No, if something's a sin, you say stop it right now. And that's what this new abolition movement was doing. These reformers demanded an immediate end to slavery, no colonization, and integration of freed people into American society as Americans. They used very explosive language, and they insisted that African Americans had a right to be equal citizens of the Republic. They said that perfecting American society meant rooting out racism. It wouldn't be a perfect society until this was taken care of. The first really forceful indication of this new spirit came in 1829. In that year, David Walker, a free black man in Boston, wrote a book called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. It was this very passionate indictment of slavery and racial prejudice, and it's one of the rare books written in this era that is still actually really readable to modern audiences, because you from our perspective, it makes a lot more sense than it did to people at the time it was written, because it's moving closer to the world that we have now. Or perhaps a more accurate way to say it is the world we have now is moving closer to the perfect world that David Walker was writing about. We're not quite there yet, though. Walker called on black Americans to mobilize for abolition by force if necessary, and he warned white Americans that the nation would face God's punishment if they didn't stop this sin. Walker called on African Americans to take pride in the achievements of ancient African civilizations. Well, I say ancient, but they're not even that old. I mean, the Empire of Mali and Great Zimbabwe, and to demand their rights as Americans. He wrote, "Tell us no more about colonization, for America is as much our country as it is yours." Well, almost immediately, a number of southern states put a bounty on his head, and he was found dead under mysterious circumstances less than a year later. In 1831, though, a weekly journal called The Liberator was first published, and that took a lot of Walker's ideas and ran with it. William Lloyd Garrison was the editor of The Liberator, and he wrote in the first edition, "I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch." Now, some of Garrison's ideas were incredibly radical. At one point, he said that the North should secede from the Union to avoid being corrupted by slavery. Most abolitionists rejected ideas like that, not least because the North was already corrupted by slavery. Garrison's writings persuaded many potential abolitionists that African Americans must be recognized as part of American society and not as aliens to be shipped overseas. Beginning with a handful of activists, the abolitionist movement expanded rapidly throughout the North. Anti-slavery leaders took advantage of new print technology and growing literacy to spread their message. These abolitionists seized on the steam press, very recently invented steam press, to create millions of copies of speeches and essays and novels. I mean, between the formation of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1830 and the end of that decade, about 100,000 Northerners joined local abolition groups, and most of them were just regular people, farmers and shopkeepers and craftsmen. Now, William Lloyd Garrison, was probably the best propagandist of this movement, but its most famous speaker was Theodore Weld. Weld was personally a very brilliant orator. He was also a very good teacher of oration, and he trained speakers who would tour the North. They were very similar to revivalist preachers, fervent, fire and brimstone preaching, and lengthy meetings, and calls to renounce sin, and that was their message, right, that slavery is a sin. Many Southerners, of course, were afraid that the abolitionists were trying to economically threaten them, and were also going to spark a slave rebellion. That belief was strengthened after Nat Turner's rebellion, which came just a few months after the first edition of The Liberator was published. Now, Nat Turner never read The Liberator. Garrison was completely unknown to him. Most abolitionists rejected violence as a means of ending slavery. Many of them were just outright pacifists. Their strategy was, they called it moral suasion, moral persuasion. Slave owners needed to be convinced that they were wrong. The North needed to be convinced that they were complicit in this wrong. Abolitionists were among the first to really recognize the role of public opinion in a democracy. They didn't go straight to the top. I mean, they didn't try to get the president and the vice president and the cabinet and the Congress on their side. They focused on awakening a moral fervor in the nation. Abolitionists argued that slavery was so deeply embedded in American life that if you want to destroy it, it's going to take fundamental social change. Not just a change in the law, but a change in society as well. They insisted that the inherent, natural, absolute right to personal liberty was more important than any other kind of freedom. Now, by this point, like we talked about when we talked about the Jacksonian era, the rights of citizens had become more and more closely tied to being white. But the abolitionists wanted to bring back that old Enlightenment revolutionary idea that freedom is universal. The origin of the idea of an American people unbounded by race lies with the abolitionists. Now, the anti-slavery crusade viewed slaves and freedmen as members of our national community. Lydia Maria Child, we talked about her. She's that woman who published housekeeping tips. She was also an abolitionist. She wrote a treatise in which she said that being American-born meant being an American citizen. Now, that was not a part of American law at the time she wrote that, but it would become enshrined in American law with the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. Another leading abolitionist speaker was Angelina Grimke. She said that the crusade against slavery was America's most important school of human rights. Abolitionists debated all sorts of things, the Constitution's relationship to slavery, the balance between equality and inequality and freedom and all of that. And one thing that the majority of abolitionists that we've talked about so far have in common is that, like this poster of Pioneers of Freedom, most of them were white. Okay, next slide. Where are you? Certainly Frederick Douglass and David Walker, Harriet Tubman were black. But the public face of abolitionism, the most prominent members, the names, were white. Former slaves were encouraged to tell their stories, but they were usually rewritten and repackaged and sold by white abolitionists, so the slaves themselves hardly ever got the acclaim. In fact, the most famous piece of anti-slavery literature was based on the real-life stories of two actual human beings, whose names you almost certainly don't know. But you probably know the name of the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and you may even have known the name of the author, Harriet Beecher Stowe. But you don't know the names of the slaves that it was based on. Josiah Henson was the slave who told his life story to various abolitionist societies and who became the basis of the character of Uncle Tom. The character of Eliza, the one who is fleeing from slavery with her baby strapped to her back as she tries to cross the frozen Ohio River, again based on a real-life woman. Her name was Elizabeth. The real-life story was actually one of those stories that Harriet Beecher Stowe wouldn't write it the way it happened because it was just too awesome for anybody to believe. You know, reality is frequently unrealistic. The actual slave Elizabeth that the character of Eliza was based on was trying to get her grandchildren out of slavery, and there were 5 of them. So she wasn't just crossing the Ohio River with one kid. She strapped each one to her back, crossed the river, then went back for the next one. So she did this 5 times. And by the time she got the last one across, and they were on free territory, they were in Ohio, the slave catchers had caught up to her. And there was one waiting on the other side of the river and had her other 4 grandchildren waiting for her there. And when she got across the river with the last one, he let her go because she was just that freaking badass. Right? You see an old woman doing that 5 times, man, you don't take her back into slavery, you just let her go. By the 1840s, black abolitionists wanted an independent role in the movement, and they were beginning to hold their own conventions. And one of the reasons for that is that white abolitionists would often take a leadership role, but then they wouldn't be as forceful as black abolitionists wanted to be, and they weren't as willing to let black speakers be as forceful as they wanted to be. I mean, for example, there was a black conference in 1843. Henry Highland Garnet was one of the speakers. He was a black man speaking before an all-black audience at an all-black conference, and in his speech he said that slaves should rise in rebellion. Well, even though everybody in the audience totally approved of what he was saying, it was so controversial among white abolitionists that the publishers would not include his speech in the transcripts of the convention, like he'd never spoken at all. At every opportunity, black abolitionists rejected America's pretense to be a land of freedom. Free black communities in the North created a new calendar for freedom celebrations, not centered on the 4th of July, but on the 1st of January. And January 1st is the day that the African slave trade was outlawed, so that actually meant something to them. Even more persistently than their white allies, black abolitionists supported the idea of a colorblind citizenship. A black Presbyterian minister, Samuel Cornish, wrote that the real battleground between liberty and slavery is prejudice against color. The greatest oration, the greatest speech on American slavery and American freedom was delivered at a 4th of July celebration, actually, in Rochester, New York in 1852. Rochester had this massive Independence Day celebration. Frederick Douglass was invited to speak, and right after that celebration was over, he got up and said, "What to the slave is the 4th of July? It is nothing." He said that the 4th of July was a hypocritical celebration. It showed, a nation that claimed to believe in liberty, but every day committed and accepted atrocities. He argued that Britain, we're celebrating the 4th of July to celebrate independence from Britain, and he said that Britain was actually a better model of freedom than the United States, because Britain had outlawed slavery in all of its territories in 1830. It's going to take 35 years for the United States to catch up. And of course, at this point, when Douglass is giving the speech, he doesn't know if we'll ever catch up. Now, at first, abolitionism created violent hostility, not just in the South, but in the North as well. Many white Northerners were afraid that abolition would disrupt the Union. It would interfere with the economy. It would overturn white supremacy. Mobs would disrupt abolitionist meetings. They would attack speakers in northern cities. In 1837, Elijah Lovejoy became the first abolitionist martyr when he was killed by a mob in Illinois. They tried to destroy his printing press, and when he jumped in to stop them, they killed him. And in 1838, a mob in Philadelphia burned Pennsylvania Hall to the ground to stop an abolitionist from speaking. They were very patriotic arsonists, though. They did carry out a picture of President Washington before they set the building on fire. Now, in the South, crowds would steal abolitionist literature from the mail and then have big bonfires of it. And the Postmaster General did nothing to stop them. When abolitionists started to send petitions to Congress calling for emancipation, the House of Representatives adopted a gag rule. They wouldn't debate abolition. They wouldn't read the petitions. In fact, if an envelope looked like it contains a petition, they're not even going to open it. Those mob attacks and the gag rule and everything together began to convince many Northerners who had really been kind of iffy on the whole abolitionist thing that maybe slavery was hurting their freedom too. I mean, even if they don't care anything about freedom for the slave, they don't want to see their own freedom and their own safety compromised. And all of this is hurting them. You know, it's limiting their ability to speak. It's limiting what kind of mail they can send and to whom. So it's limiting their freedom of the press. It's limiting their freedom of assembly. It's limiting their ability to contact their congressman. I mean, what if they send something to a congressman and he doesn't open it because he thinks there might be a petition in there? You know, slavery is a threat to everybody. Frederick Douglass wrote that when the true history of the abolitionist movement is written, women will occupy a large space in its pages. And much of the grassroots strength of the abolitionist movement came from Northern women, both black and white, who joined by the thousands. They were evangelical Protestants, old New England Congregationalists, Quakers convinced that slavery was a disgrace. The public sphere was open to women in a way that government and politics weren't, and they used that long before they could vote. Women circulated petitions, they raised money, they went to debates. Usually didn't speak at those because it's scandalous for a woman to talk to a mixed audience, but they would listen. Women were active in all sorts of reform movements, temperance and prison reform and school reform, and all of those activities let women carve out a place in the public sphere. But it was the abolitionist movement specifically that inspired the early fight for women's rights. In working for rights for the slave, many women began to take a second look at their own subordinate status. Angelina and Sarah Grimke were the daughters of a South Carolina slave owner, a very wealthy man. They converted to Quakerism, and in the 1830s they began to deliver popular lectures that condemned slavery from the perspective of people who had seen it firsthand. They also bullied one of their cousins, not quite into freeing his slaves, although they tried. They bullied him into becoming one of the more humane slave owners in South Carolina. He had a rice plantation outside of Charleston that I think you can still visit, where in defiance of the law, he did actually let his slaves learn to read, but they couldn't quite get him to free them. Now, their speaking activities were not viewed kindly, even by other abolitionists, because they're chicks. A group of ministers up in Massachusetts denounced the Grimke sisters for, make sure I get this quote right, sacrificing all modesty and delicacy by speaking in public. In reply, the sisters defended their right to be part of the public debate, and also said that women should be able to share in the political and the educational privileges of men. Sarah Grimke wrote that letter that some of you read for your quiz, a letter on the equality of the sexes in 1838, raised a lot of issues that women are still familiar with us, today. Equal pay for equal work was a big one. The Grimke sisters were the first women to publicly take that abolitionist doctrine of universal freedom and apply it to the status of women. Their writings helped to spark the movement for women's rights that came about in the 1840s. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her friend Lucretia Mott were the key organizers of the first Women's Rights Convention, and they were also veterans of the abolitionist movement. In 1840, they had been sent to London. They were so excited about this. Their local abolition society had chosen them to represent them at the World Anti-Slavery Convention. So they went to London. They were going to go to this convention. It was going to be great. And they weren't allowed in because they're women. Well, they just kicked up such a fuss that they were finally allowed to enter the building, but they had to sit in a balcony behind a curtain. They couldn't vote and they couldn't speak because the men were not supposed to know that there were women in the building, because apparently the idea of a naked female ankle anywhere in the vicinity would have just disrupted the whole thing. Well, they came home really miffed about this and questioning whether in fact they were free. In 1848, they organized the first Women's Rights Convention, the Seneca Falls Convention, up in New York, and it raised the issue of women's suffrage for the first time. Suffrage is voting rights, right? Not suffering, it's suffrage. The Declaration of Sentiments adopted there listed the myriad injuries done by men to women, and the first listed was denying her the right to vote. Stanton, in particular, was convinced that only the vote would make women free, because in a democratic society, freedom was impossible without the vote. Seneca Falls was the beginning of the 70-year struggle for women's suffrage, but the vote was not the only issue raised there. The Declaration of structure of gender inequality, everything that denied women the opportunity to get education and employment, and gave husbands control over the property of his wives, and deprived women of legal status and restricted them to the home. Women also demanded the right to be a part of the market revolution. At an 1851 Women's Rights Convention, the black abolitionist Sojourner Truth insisted that the women's movement should give attention to the needs of poor and working class women. She repudiated the idea that real women were too delicate to work outside the home. You probably heard it, seen it performed, read it in high school. It's the Ain't I a Woman speech. Sojourner Truth talks about her life as a slave, the heavy labor she had to do. Nobody ever lifted her into a carriage, and nobody ever carried her over a mud puddle. Nobody ever treated her like a delicate flower, but she was still a woman. Those who gathered at women's rights meetings tended to be middle class or upper class, but they fully rejected the idea that the home was the only place for women. During the 1850s, some feminists tried to popularize a different style of dress that would let women have more freedom of movement, let them be a part of the outside world. Amelia Bloomer created the Bloomer costume. Loose-fitting tunic, puffy trousers, looked kind of ridiculous, even back then. Not a very popular look, actually, but it made a serious point. The clothes that most women were expected to wear, long dresses, masses and masses of petticoats, tight corsets. I mean, look how much this woman is squeezed here. That made it almost impossible for women to work outside the home, to be a part of the public sphere, to be physically active. And, sometimes these clothes were actually life-threatening. Those corsets, those steel bone corsets could squish your organs. It could break ribs. That was actually a favorable outcome if your lower ribs were broken, because then you can just tie it a little tighter. You can't breathe. in those things, so it's really difficult to be physically active. I mean, can you imagine trying to play tennis or ride a bike wearing one of those things? The fluffy dresses and the petticoats were sometimes made out of actually flammable material, especially if you were in mourning. Mourning clothes were made out of a material known as silk crepe, which if you've ever decorated with crepe paper, imagine that mixed with silk. That's what it is. You get too close to a fire, well, you're not in mourning anymore, but your family is. Now, the dichotomy between freedom and slavery that women learned in the abolitionist movement, it powerfully shaped the language that they used to talk about their own needs. Just like Northern workers talked about wage slavery, women reformers talked about the slavery of sex, and they pointed out that the laws of marriage gave men nearly as much control over their wives as over their slaves. Now, marriage was not, literally speaking, the same as slavery. It was usually voluntarily entered into. But the married woman didn't enjoy the fruits of her own labor, which was a central part of freedom, did not legally have control of their own bodies. In every state, husbands were legally allowed to physically discipline their wives. Marital rape was not a crime in any state, and in fact did not become a crime in all 50 states until 1993. Now, some states, in the couple of years before the Civil War, half decade to a decade before the war, some states began to fix some of their laws. Some states let women sign contracts. Some states would let them buy and sell property. Some would let them keep their own wages, but only some. Women's rights activists, being so influenced by abolition, they took the idea of self-ownership and they turned it into this new direction. The law of domestic relations said that a husband had a right to sexual access to his wife, the right to inflict corporal punishment on her. Courts were very reluctant to step in unless the abuse became extreme, but they all defined that differently. Women's activists began to demand that women should have the right to regulate their own sexuality, regulate their procreation, and be protected against violence by their husband just like they would be against violence by a stranger. But these demands, even among reformers, these demands were very controversial. You know, reformers could accept prison reform, they could accept abolition. Women's rights, though, it might be a bridge too far. One of the most famous reformers of the 1800s, Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, was an abolitionist. He was part of the school reform movement. He pioneered humane treatment for the blind. But he could not support his wife's interest in women's rights. He complained that it made her neglect her family duties. His dinner wasn't on the table. In the 1840s, the abolitionist movement split over the woman question. A woman was appointed to the business committee of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Her name was Abby Kelly. She's actually the abolitionist that in Philadelphia they burnt Pennsylvania Hall to stop an abolitionist from speaking. It was actually Abby Kelly. Some men decided that they could not be a part of a group where women held leadership positions, that was not correct. That's not the society they want to be part of. And so they left. They formed their own anti-slavery society. The abolitionist poet John Greenleaf Whittier wrote a poem comparing Abby Kelly to Eve and Delilah and Helen of Troy and all of these terrible women who've broken the world apart. Some abolitionists were just afraid that if they supported too many ideas, that it would hurt the movement. The men who left the original anti-slavery society were determined to create a political force for abolition, and they were afraid that they could not get mainstream support if women's rights was attached to that. Now, the women's rights movement succeeded in making the woman question a permanent part of social reform. As for abolition, by 1840, that movement had formed more than 1,000 local societies all over the North and was continuing to spread its message. And probably its greatest achievement just lay in shattering that conspiracy of silence that had tried to preserve national unity at the expense of human lives. And we'll talk about the shattering of national unity, actually, in the next lecture. So you are free to go.